All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's Cameron with the Contrarian Podcast. Today's the day, as you have seen with the title. I am going to be talking about the biblical view on ethnicity, which is going to be a contrary point to InterVarsity's multi-ethnicity, which we'll break down later. Again, I'm Cameron. Thank you for joining me today. This one's going to be a bit of a doozy and probably a long one. And I really hope that I can keep it on track. But I've had to sort of explain my position over the years. And it's not one that can just be explained with a few verses as InterVarsity does with its multi-ethnicity view. They only take like a couple verses or a couple chapters. What I'm about to tell you is a broad, encompassing view of what I think the Bible says. And again, a couple of prefaces. I don't think I'm 100% right. This is just what I know so far. So I'm not going to try and prescribe this, but I believe what I know now is definitely different than what is currently being taught. Also, I'm going to say I think I'm the only one within InterVarsity who probably has this view. I'm not saying that just because I have a different view, I need to be listened to in a sort of sense. But as I view it, I believe that this is the view that I'm going to hold on to and keep, because I think anything else actually is rather, well, idolatrous, and it really it misrepresents God in all sorts of facets. So what are we going to do? I'm going to be taking you through actually the entire biblical history, because this is something that needs to be explained over the entire Bible. If we're talking about ethnicity is actually very much tied up with the biblical story. And you may be wondering, well, why is that? It's not ever really taught in mainstream Christian denominations, what I'm about to tell you, mostly because what I'm about to tell you has implications beyond what I'm saying. It involves an adherence to Torah and other things. And so those are separate other arguments, which we could get into later. But for now, I believe it's not going to be helpful to talk about those things. I'm just going to explain sort of the biblical view. So this video is, I want to say it's mostly for me to make clear what I believe, but actually I don't necessarily think that much anymore. I think I need to say what I need to say because there's a lot of untruth going on out there. And I really want to address the untruth and combat it. And so where does this sort of knowledge and information of mine come from? And I was asked about 3 years ago to give a talk on multi-ethnicity. And so I'm going to tell a little story first. When I was in InterVarsity as the intern in 2014, as I was explaining in a previous video, at an orientation of new staff, of course, they give the sort of talk on multi-ethnicity. And it really struck me because I forgot who was giving the talk, but he's like, multi-ethnicity is a word. We made it up. We completely made it up. You can't find it anywhere in the Bible. And it's true. You can't find multi-ethnicity anywhere in the Bible. But they're like, doesn't matter because it explains what we believe the scriptures say. And if you know me at all to any capacity, you know that I strongly dislike making up words to suit your theology. That is some poor biblical hermeneutics, as we're going to look at it. So, of course, this is around the time in my life when I am believing the multi-ethnicity thing. So then when I'm asked to give a talk on multi-ethnicity 3 or 4 years ago, I can't remember exactly, within my own student fellowship, I'm struck because my own research runs contrary to what InterVarsity is saying. And so I'm going to lay out this view. And basically, my thesis for this thing is that the church and Christians have an identity crisis right now, and it's very difficult to deal with. The church is having a hard time identifying who it is, and you get all sorts of factions running around. Like, I am a Latino follower of God, or I'm a black worshiper of Jesus, or, you even get the, I'm a white, European follower of God, and you get all these weird identities mixed up, and it's very mixed in the sort of identitarian politics. It's very mixed in with the oh man, can't remember the name of it. Anyway, moving on. So it's all mixed in there, and it's not unifying as I think InterVarsity would want it to be. So let's start off. I'm going to specifically look at this timeline of the Old Testament. Alexa, stop. All right. Looking at this biblical timeline. This is a timeline I made of the Old Testament. And of course, we are going to mostly start around the patriarchs, moving onward. But we're talking about creation. God created heavens and the earth. Man sinned and fell, and was therefore rightfully put away from God's holiness. But God came up with a plan to basically present with a solution to evil, and he's going to do it with a family through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So, if you kind of already are tracking with those 3 points, I don't think I really need to go into them much, but let's get into what we see when we're talking about specifically the words ethnos, ethnicity, nations, Gentiles. It really all means the same thing. So I'm going to explain to you a little bit of my methodology for looking into these things. My methodology is that if I'm looking up a word, specifically a Greek word in the New Testament, you should wonder, where is the biblical precedence for that? So I don't believe that God's changed at all. I think he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so I think that you have to look at the Old Testament as the precedence for the New Testament. The entire Old Testament is the foundation for the New Testament. So when there's an idea in the New Testament, it actually comes from an idea in the Old Testament. So there are layers of translation. English translations are crap. I'm just going to be honest. They're not great. I find mistakes in English translations all the time. And I'm going to probably go through a few of them with you today. But English translations are bad. One, they're biased, so they have to basically adhere to a certain theology no matter what, even if the word says something else. And two, you're not going to get an accurate one-for-one translation of the word. So what you're talking about is you're talking about Hebrew ideas translated into Greek, then translated into English, and then read with a 21st century Western Christian mindset. And so my methodology is I want to get back to just the Hebrew idea, because the Hebrew idea is the biblical idea, and I can basically track it back and prove you. So the way I'm going to sort of do that with some of these words and phrases is, if you know what the Septuagint is, it is a Greek translation of the Old Testament, and it's the first common widespread, essentially, Bible. And so it's the Old Testament and some apocryphal books. They're translated into Greek, and this is the Bible that is widely circulating at the time of Jesus and the apostles. When Paul is talking about using Scripture to basically correct and teach, he's talking about using the Septuagint, right? That's the thing that they could send to synagogues everywhere. It was a translation that was easily copied because Torah scrolls, as they go, and many of the other scrolls, they're really weighty, they're hard to do, you need a scribe to do them. But the Septuagint is written in Greek, so many people can read it. So what you can do is you can use the Septuagint kind of as a decoder ring. You can look up basically a New Testament word. Let's say, for example, ethnos, the one we're going to be looking at specifically today. And ethnos is the word for nations. It is the word for Gentiles in the New Testament. So what you can do is you can look in the Septuagint, and then anytime that ethnos is used in the Old Testament, you can assume that that is the Hebrew idea for it. And so our first, of course, point is that ethnos, translated to Hebrew, is going to be goy or goyim. And that essentially means a foreign nation, a Gentile. If you look at the Paleo Hebrew, it means like a gathering of stakes, essentially. So ethnicity is in wide terminology, used to describe a people group of a certain place, right? And nationhood and ethnicity are actually very tied to location. So the term is goy or goyim, and that's going to be a term we really need to know as we move forward. So as we go back to essentially that biblical timeline, Abraham is the founding member of essentially the covenant. This is a covenant that God makes, and this is a view of covenant. And so Abraham is told in Genesis 12, I will make you a great nation. So I'm going to make you a great goyim. I'm going to make you a big nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you are to be a blessing. And as we move through the Abraham story, right, he has a son Isaac, and Isaac has a son Jacob, and this promise, this covenantal promise for becoming a great nation, a great goy, as it is in the Greek, that it starts to be shown through fruition with really Jacob, with Israel. And Israel is, of course, brought into captivity in Egypt, but they are rescued by God, and this is where things start to really take shape. Because when God calls Israel out of Egypt, he starts to talk about Israel as a nation, but he talks about them as a nation that's much different than any other nations. And he talks about them in this way. So in Exodus 12:38, he refers to Israel that is being rescued as a mixed multitude. So not just Israelites within the camp, but also many Egyptians and whoever else was sojourning in the land. They become Israel. They leave with Israel. So in Exodus 12:28-38, it's a mixed multitude. Exodus 12:38, a mixed crowd went with them also, as well as many livestock in large numbers, both flocks and herds. And so over Passover, he rescues Israel, but it is not until Sinai, when he gives this law to Israel, that he cements his covenant with them. And basically he asks them in Exodus 19, will you abide by this covenant? And here is Exodus 19:3. You have seen... there it is. Moshe went up to God and asked Adonai from the mountain, here is what to say to the household of Yaakov and to tell the people of Israel. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you myself. Now pay careful attention to what I say and keep my covenant. Then you will be my own treasure from among the peoples. For the earth is mine. You will be a kingdom of Kohanim, that is priests, a nation set apart. These words you are to speak to Israel. And basically, they all say all the things that you are about to speak, we shall do. So they affirm this covenant. They are to become holy nation, a kingdom of priests. Exodus 19:6 in a different translation, you shall be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. So here I'm going to do a little bit of Septuagint translation. What we see when we look at holy nation is ethnos hagios. Ethnos meaning, of course, nation, but hagios is a word that means basically holy and holiness, biblical holiness. What does that mean? And when we're really talking about basically Exodus onward, what it means to be holy is to be set apart. And so Israel is to be a nation set apart, and holiness means also to be set not just apart from like the world, but to be set apart for God's purpose. So Israel is an ethnos hagios, a holy nation. So they're a nation, but they're very different from all the other nations. And so, I mean, I'm going to do some New Testament showing you that even in 2 Peter, when Peter is using the same words to describe it, he uses ethnos hagios, a holy nation. And even a lot in the New Testament, they use the term ecclesia to describe the church. And so let's look at an Old Testament version of ecclesia using the Septuagint. And a lot of times in the Old Testament, when God is describing Israel, what you could see is that the word used there in the Greek is the church. So Israel and church, you could almost say, are synonymous. So here is some research that I didn't do, but somebody else did. The word ecclesia, translated church in the New Testament, was used frequently in the Septuagint. In this study, we will survey the use of ecclesia in the Septuagint. The first instances come in the Law of Moses, the assembly at Horeb, when the Lord spoke directly to the Israelites, called on that day the ecclesia. On this occasion, God commanded Moses to gather, essentially, the ecclesia. The sacred assembly of Israel was to worship for official business was the ecclesia. The Law of Moses outlined very strict regulations on who could and could not enter the ecclesia of the Lord. One who was emasculated could not, one who, all these things. At the close of the book of Deuteronomy, and the Song of Moses was recited in the hearing of all the ecclesia of Israel. So ecclesia is a word that means a calling out, and that really fits Israel well. They were called out of Egypt. And so when you see church in New Testament terms, they're using the word ecclesia, but really you could just say it's a calling out. They're people called out to be what? Well, to be holy. They're to be a nation set apart from the world, and a nation set apart for God's purposes. So, I mean, we can go to more look at this sort of terminology for ethnos hagios, this holy nation, Israel. Leviticus 19:1 and 2, speak, and this is repeated a lot of times in Leviticus, speak to the entire community of Israel, tell them, you are to be holy, because I, Adonai, your God, Yahweh, your Elohim, am holy. You know, don't do the things of the world. You are far different from them. And he explains his reasoning in Deuteronomy 4. Which great nation is there that has laws and rulings just as this entire Torah, which I'm setting before you today? This is a nation unlike any other nation. Israel is given the way to live by God, but it is part of a covenant agreement. We will follow what you have to say, and you will be our God, and we'll be your holy nation. We'll be your ethnos hagios. So a huge, crucial piece of information to start understanding where I'm going to be getting at in this is that Deuteronomy 30, I covered it a little bit a couple days ago, but it lays out, follow this Torah, right? You, the nation that have decided to follow it. If you follow it, it's going to be great for all the days of your life. But if you don't, a lot of curses are going to fall on your head. You're going to plant a vineyard and you're not going to eat its fruits. all sorts of really tragic things. But more importantly, you're going to be sent away into exile, and you're going to be driven from the land that's not your own. But there is a crucial piece to know that when God says he's going to do it, he's still faithful to his agreement with Israel. And I'm just going to read it. When the time arrives that all these things come upon you, both the blessing and the curse which I have presented you, you are there, and you are there among the nations. Essentially, you're scattered and exiled, to which Yahweh your Elohim has driven you. Then at last you will start thinking about what has happened to you. And you will return to Yahweh your Elohim and pay attention to what he says, which will be exactly what I am ordering today, you and your children, with all your hearts. At that point, Yahweh your Elohim will reverse your exile and show you mercy. He will gather you from all the peoples. I mean, that word could be, I haven't looked at it, that could be nations, to which Yahweh your Elohim scattered you. If one of yours was scattered to the far end of the sky, Yahweh your Elohim will gather you even from there. He will go there and get you. What a good God. Seriously. Yahweh your Elohim will bring you back to the land of your ancestors possessed, and you'll possess it. He will make you prosper there, and you will become more numerous than your ancestors. Then Yahweh your Elohim will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your children, that you will love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart and all your being, and thus you will live. Yahweh will put all of these curses on your enemies, those who hated and persecuted you, but you will return and pay attention to what he says, to obey all this mitzvot, all these laws that I'm giving you today. And Adonai your God will give you more than enough, and everything you set out to do, the fruit of your body, the fruit of your livestock, the fruit of your land, will all do well, for Yahweh will once again see you, and you will do well, just as he rejoiced in your ancestors. However, all this will happen if you pay attention to what Yahweh your Elohim says. So obey his mitzvot and regulation, which I am written in this book of Torah. If you turn to God with all your heart and all your being. And this is the big story really unfolding. Israel's given the option: obey my covenant or be sent to exile. But even if you do, don't worry, I'm still a good God and I will regather you. Right? And so, again, the choice is between life and death, between the blessing and the curse. You follow the law or you don't. And let's get back to that sort of timeline as we're going. So the covenant, Israel enters and occupies the land, but we have to understand that they are not keeping this covenant. Right from the get-go, of course, I mean, even from the get-go when they're given the covenant, they can't keep it. They immediately build a golden calf and worship this golden calf. They immediately violate the first two commandments, which are given in the mitzvot. So Yeshua, Jesus, conquers the land, and they, Israel's driven into this cycle where they are far from Torah. So sometimes they fall into obedience, but then they fall into disobedience, and then nations come and they attack them, and then they're like, "Oh God, come save us." God delivers a judge, and this cycle keeps repeating until Israel grumbles enough that they ask for basically a king. We want to be like all the other nations. Please, give us a king. And God gives Saul, so he gives Shaul, and then he later gives David as a king. And the thing about these kingdoms is that actually God is all right with it, but it's a big, really middle finger to God. It's like, we don't want you to be our king anymore, God. We want a real human king. God is still faithful to his covenant promise with Abraham, to his faithful covenant. I mean, this covenant keeps getting revealed to Isaac, to Israel, and this Israel made a covenant with, God at Sinai, and the land is part of that covenant, correct? David is promised that he'll have a throne that lasts forever over the whole of Israel, and this throne will last forever. And you would think, okay, that's cool, and he would think it was probably his son, Solomon, Shlomo, who ends up taking the land. It very quickly turns out that God does not, that David's line is actually rapidly declining, because after Solomon's reign, the kingdom's divided. And not a lot of people look at this sort of biblical history as an important part of what's going on, but of course the kingdom is divided into two kingdoms. And so from this point, I need to sort of clarify what I'm saying here. When people refer to, so I'm going to refer to things as the house of Israel, so the kingdom of Israel, and the house of Judah. And that is what they're referred to a lot in the Bible. So the northern kingdom is the house of Israel. Southern kingdom is the house of Judah. Israel reigns in Samaria. Judah reigns in Jerusalem. And there's a line of kings in, of course, both of these kingdoms. When I'm talking about Israel, I'm going to be talking about like the whole house of Israel, both the southern and northern kingdom. So the whole house of Israel is Israel. The kingdom of Israel is the northern kingdom, or the house of Israel. The southern kingdom is the house of Judah, or as it is referred to today by a lot of people, the Jews. And so this has also nothing to really do with the modern nation state of Israel that is currently in this area. It has very much to do with biblical sort of principles and ideas. So don't conflate the terms that Israel, when I talk about Israel, I don't necessarily mean house of Israel. And when I'm talking about Israel, I'm not talking, of course, about the modern nation state of Israel. I'm referring to the whole restored Israel. And when I refer to house of Israel, I'm going to refer to essentially the northern kingdom. So the northern kingdom and southern kingdom are divided up, and people start to reign. Not great kings. Where's my... There it is. Okay. So we have to start talking about this Davidic line, this eternal throne, this division of monarchy. But both the house of Israel and the house of Judah break God's covenant. They're not great at following the law. They're actually pretty bad at it. And so God sends prophets, and these are the biblical prophets, and you should really read the biblical prophets. Judah has a myriad of good and bad kings. Sometimes they follow God, sometimes they worship the Baals. The northern kingdom, Israel, is almost all bad, right? And these prophets that are in the Old Testament are speaking to these people, and they're like, get back, repent, follow Torah, follow the law. So, you have like Isaiah, who's a prophet to the southern kingdom, and you have people like Elisha and others that are prophets to the northern kingdom. Even Jonah is possibly living in Israel, Hosea, all these prophets. So these prophets are speaking to these nations, telling them to get back on essentially God's covenant, or else, remember what he said? He said he's going to drive you among the nations. He's going to exile you. Big surprise, they don't listen. And in 722, the northern kingdom, the house of Israel, is sent into Assyrian captivity. And the southern kingdom doesn't follow. 150 years later, the southern kingdom then is sent into exile, and they are exiled into Babylon. Book of Lamentations is a really sad book, but it's very true. And what it says is this, God, you were right to do what you did. You were right to destroy the temple, to sack Jerusalem, and all the incredible loss of life that happened when both of these nations fell. These prophets warned he would do it. He warned of just the coming calamity should they continue to disobey his law, but they they still worshipped other gods and they didn't hold close to that covenant. So what you have is you have the northern kingdom, which is essentially dispersed, and they are let's get back. So the northern kingdom of Israel, Samaria, they ran out of Samaria. They're dispersed into Assyria, and they essentially are assimilated. And when we're talking about the kingdom of Israel, that's 10 tribes of the 12 tribes of the house of Israel. And then the kingdom of Judah is 2, possibly plus 1 tribe. The Levites don't have land of their own. Is the southern kingdom. So the Assyrians conquer, and when we're talking about like Jesus's time on the scene, the Samaritans are essentially that group of people that have been assimilated into Assyria. That's why I think a lot of the disciples looked down on the Samaritans, because it's like this half-breed thing. You were conquered and assimilated into the Goy. The nations took you over. Whereas the southern kingdom, it wasn't as cut and dry. They are sent into Babylon, but Abba, he is very faithful. He remembered his promise with the people, specifically with the house of Judah, who is very blessed. And they're sent to Babylon, and after 70 years, they actually come back and they're allowed to rebuild Jerusalem. And so this is sort of the end of the Old Testament, essentially timeline of what happens. Is they're sent back, and they are at this point now referred to as Jews, right? Judah, Jews, it makes sense. So the Jews are pretty much the tribe of Benjamin and Judah, and they are all that's left of the tribes. So you got to say, oh, this is really rough. This is bad history. Let's get back to that timeline. Got to pull it up. There it is. Okay. So, division warning, the entire place is captured. Then they're sent into exile, and they are returned after exile. We have to really go back into those Old Testament prophecies, because this is a very incomplete picture. Only Judah has come back. And by the time Jesus comes on the scene, it's really just Judah and nobody else. But the Old Testament gives some very beautiful, beautiful pictures of what the restoration of Israel looks like. And so just read the prophets. I saw Jeremiah 3. I saw, even though backsliding, Israel had committed adultery. So I had sent her away. I had given her a divorce document. Unfaithful Judah, her sister, was not far moved. Instead, she too went and prostituted herself. So there are still, anyway, that's to reiterate the previous point. Let's move on to the next point. Sorry. Jeremiah 31. This is the new covenant. When people are talking about the new covenant, look at Jeremiah 31. Here are the days coming, says Yahweh, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their fathers that day I took them by their hand and brought them out of the land of Egypt, because for their part they violated my covenant, even though I, for my part, was a husband to them, says Yahweh. For this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says Yahweh. I will put my Torah within them, I will write it on their hearts, I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will any of them teach his fellow community member or his brother, know Yahweh, for they will all know me, from the least to the greatest, because I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. It's not necessarily a new covenant, it's a renewed covenant. Just as the same way a new moon is not actually a new moon, the Hebrew understanding is that it's a renewed moon. For the same thing, it's not a new year, it's just a renewed year. It is a renewed covenant that he's going to make with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Ezekiel, boy, there's a lot of stuff in for here, but I'm going to go through it rather quickly. This is the view of resurrection, valley of dry bones. Suddenly all these bones, which are the dead ones of the house of Israel and the house of Judah, are given flesh and sinew and reborn. Human being, these bones are the whole house of Israel. The whole house. Not just house of Israel. It's house of Israel and house of Judah. They are saying, our bones have been dried up. Our hope is gone. We are completely cut off. And then he speaks to the bones, and suddenly they are brought back to life. And this is a view of the resurrection. It is a view of the same resurrection that Jesus gives us all. He has given, he's the first fruit of the dead, the first fruit of the resurrection. And much like this, your bones and sinew will be remade whole, and you will rise again. Then, after sort of showing Ezekiel these things, you, human being, take one stick. Stick is a pretty poor translation here. Stick in Hebrew could also mean tree. I mean, just as the same way that aretz for earth could just mean like a small bit of dust, or it could mean, my backyard, or it could mean the entire earth. So stick here could mean tree. You, human being, take one stick and write on it for Judah, and those joined with him among the people of Israel. And those joined with. Next, take the other stick and write on it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and the house of Israel, who are joined to him. Finally, bring them together into a single stick, so that they may be one in your hands. When they ask what it is, and then you show them, put together the stick of Judah, and make a single stick, so that they become one in my hand. And he says later, I will take the people of Israel from among the nations where they have gone, and gather them from every side, and bring them back to their own land. I will make them a nation in the land on the mountains of Israel, and one king will be king over all of them. They will no longer be two nations. They will never again be divided by two kingdoms. And he says later, of course, and of course my servant David will be king over them. Okay, cool. Ezekiel's really good, because then he's like, but I'll also be king over them. So it's like, well, who's king over them? Is it the servant David, or is it you, God? Interesting stuff. Isaiah talks about this restoration too. Let's just go down to what I have highlighted. On that day, the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the people. The Goyim, the nations, will seek him out, and the places where he rests will be glorious. On that day, Adonai will raise his hand a second time to reclaim the remnant of his people from Ashur, Egypt, Patros, Ethiopia, Elam, Shinar, and Hamat, and the islands in the sea. He will hoist a banner for the Goyim, the assembled of the dispersed of Israel, and he'll gather the scattered of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Ephraim's jealousy will cease. Those who harass Judah will be cut off. Ephraim will stop envying Judah. Judah will stop provoking Ephraim. They will swoop down on the flank of the Philistines to the west. Together they will pillage the people to the east. They'll put on their hand over Edom and Moab, and the people of Ammon will obey them. So, this is the return, the restoration of the people of Israel. God says he's going to grab them all out of the nations, and he's going to bring them back, and then he's going to destroy his enemies with the nation of Israel, and he's just going to conquer them. So, Israel, this restoration promise is in the Old Testament, that the house of Israel is going to be restored. Okay, and that sort of concludes our biblical Old Testament timeline. If you're just following what they're all saying, essentially chronologically, the things that are happening. So these prophets are speaking of the future restoration of Israel. But, when people start reading the New Testament, they're very unaware that this is what the sort of things that happen when Jesus sort of enters the scene. And without going through, everything Jesus did, I'm only really going to focus on a couple places that really sort of drive home this point. There's a time, and there's a lot of really difficult words that Jesus have that people kind of don't have a great understanding of, because maybe they don't know the biblical history, or maybe they don't want, you have to basically really analyze all the information at this point to really understand what's going on. Specifically, what I'm talking about is just a really solid grasp of Torah and the Old Testament. When people are like, oh yeah, go read the Bible, and they're like, well, where should I start? And people are like, oh yeah, start with John. I'm just like, John is the most confusing to read. It's written to Jews. You have to have a really good prior understanding about what they're talking about to really get a good grasp of it. Anyway, I'm not trying to gatekeep reading John first. I mean, it's the first book I read, I'll be honest. But if you really want to understand John, you kind of got to know the Old Testament. Likewise, if you want to really know what Jesus says, or what Paul says, or what Peter says, or what Revelation means, you have to have a really good grasp and understanding, not only of Torah, but just of the Old Testament in general. Because all these ideas, again, they're not new ideas. They're ideas that are built upon in the Old Testament. And as you see, it's this continuous unraveling of covenant. It's not like a brand new thing. Anyway, we'll keep moving on. Anyway, Jesus does a really interesting thing when he's talking to a Canaanite woman. Remember, Canaanites are enemies of Israel. And she says, "Sir, have pity on me, son of David. My daughter is cruelly held under the power of demons." But Yeshua did not say a word to her. Then his disciples, the Talmudim, came to him and urged him, "Send her away, because she is following us and keeps pestering us with her crying." He said, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and fell at his feet and said, "Sir, help me." He answered, "It is not right to take away the children's food and toss it to their pet dogs." These are hard words. She said, "That is true, sir, but even the dogs eat the leftovers that fall from their master's table." Then Yeshua answered her, "Lady, you are a person of great trust or faith. Let your desire be granted." And her daughter was healed at that very moment. It's a weird interaction. He's like, "I'm only coming here for the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Well, the house of Israel, does that mean like that northern kingdom that was scattered? Quite possibly, yes. Judah is still around, but Israel is scattered. And Jesus says he's come for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And this Canaanite woman, an enemy of Israel, asks for her daughter to be healed. And by the end of this conversation, it's almost as if this Canaanite woman is showing, hey, like, I belong to Israel. This is not foreign concepts to what the Bible says. Because remember, Israel was a mixed multitude when it left Egypt. Not only that, but before that, even Judah, the actual son Judah, the actual son of Israel, he marries a Canaanite woman, Tamar, who becomes the progenitor of all of essentially the nation of Judah as it is today. And Tamar is a Canaanite woman who, dressed up as a prostitute to marry back into or to have children with, or perform essentially redemption, yibum, with Judah so that she could have sons for her dead husband. So Judah gets redeemed in that sort of sense. But she's a Canaanite woman, right? Tamar's not Israelite, and she's in the line of Messiah. Let's look at another person too, Rahab. She is a prostitute and also, as it turns out, a Canaanite woman who hides the spies of Israel. And she is brought into, boy, do I have it written down? I probably should. Yes, it's Joshua 6, 25. But Joshua spared Rahab, the prostitute, her father's household, and everything she had. And she continued living with Israel from then until now, because she hid the messengers of Joshua and sent the reconnoiter to Jericho. So, that too, Rahab joins into Israel. She comes into the covenant. Who's another one? I mean, there's another one in Jesus' line, and it's Ruth, right? Ruth is, she says the famous words that a lot of people repeat. She says, "Don't press me to leave you and stop following you, for wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." Ruth is the same picture of somebody coming into a person that is not Israelite coming into the covenant. And Jesus' ministry is a really crazy one. He goes among a lot of Gentiles. He's among a lot of goyim. He also, of course, preaches to Jews, but and I'm going to use an intervarsity one here, and this is from Mark's study. He's talking on the boat, and this is before it's revealed that he's the Messiah. He's using 2 miracles that he's done as a sort of view of what's happening. When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets were full of broken pieces did you collect? 12, they answered him. And when I broke 7 loaves to 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? 7, they answered. And he said, and you still don't understand. This is, of course, coming off of a small questionnaire where he's just like, well, what about the leaven of Herod and the Pharisees? And they're like, we don't have any bread. And Jesus is still talking in riddles. And if you're really looking for what this riddle means, as an intervarsity, if you're studying Mark, it's like, okay, he's feeding these Gentiles, and so these Gentiles are being fed, and the leftover baskets is 12 usually symbolizing Israel. And 7, of course, is the number of completion. And so it appears that through Jesus's miracles that he's doing when he's feeding these hungry people that are hungry for him, in a very strange way, he's saying, look how these Gentiles are coming in and things are being completed, the number 7, with the Gentiles. They are coming into Israel. That's a bit crazy, wouldn't you say, Jesus? Anyway, in other versions, he sends out the 12 and he says, sends the 12 out, don't go to territory of the Goyim, but enter any town of Shalom, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. The lost sheep of the house of Israel. Okay, how are we supposed to find them? And of course, he turns over the tables and he says, my house will be a house of prayer for all the Goyim, but you have made it into a den of robbers. And there's quite a few parables which demonstrate this sort of return of the house of Israel from the nations. And my favorite one is, of course, the parable of the prodigal son. One son is faithful, one son goes out and he lives among the nations, but then he remembers what it was like to live in his father's house, and he returns and he is celebrated. A lot of people use that in evangelical circles to represent, you were out sinning and then you came back to God. And I mean, I will not knock that. That is how I got saved. I recognized that I was out living prodigally and I needed to come back to God. But, when we're also talking about this in the context of the grander biblical narrative, it is the house of Israel went away and it lived among the nations. But the house of Judah stayed and it kept, faithful to the best of what it is. And so it's a return of 2 brothers. People that are dispensational in theology, I mean, you can sort of ask this question like, okay, imagine this anecdotally. There's a father who has a son, and the son doesn't follow any of the rules of the house, so he kicks him out and he sends him away and just like, you can't follow the rules of the house, you're done here. And then he adopts a new son, and he says to this new son, don't follow you're in this house now and I've adopted you, right? But you don't have to do the same things that my older son did, because he couldn't keep it, so I kicked him out. So you can just kind of stay here and do whatever. Like, what kind of father is that? Actually, that's kind of what people are referring to when they're referring to sort of the church superseding Israel. They're saying like the church is a different iteration of God's promise to his covenants, right? So he's like, he keeps the same covenant, but he just sort of gets rid of the unfaithful parties. And that's not a good view of what God is actually like. It's more like the parable of the prodigal son, that one went to live off with the nations, one kept it, and then the other son, the prodigal son, came back. And of course, the older son is indignant to that fact, but he eventually gets over it. Probably. It's just a parable. So this is the assertion that there is no separate church, there is no separate thing, but it is about the restoration of Israel, and that your identity is Israel, the whole and restored Israel. That includes Jews. I have, of course, problems with the term multi-ethnicity, because in some way it is sort of anti-Semitic. It basically means multi-goy, and Jews are not goy. They're the house of Judah. They're a set-apart nation, so multi-ethnicity is, in a very strange sense, anti-Semitic. They don't know that, right? They're not trying to be it, but the restored Israel is the goal. And let's look at what the apostolic writings, how they are addressing the early church. And so I'm going to try and run through these really fast. There's a lot of them. All right, so Romans chapter 1, verse 7. All those in Rome who God loves, who have been called, who have been set apart for him, grace and shalom to you, Father, the Lord Yeshua the Messiah. So NASB, called is kletos, saints is hagios. Hagios kletos. Hagios kletos, there it is in the Greek. So, who have been set apart, these holy people. When people refer to saints, they're like, oh yeah, saints. It really means people set apart. And who are the set apart people? It's Israel. Continuing on, Corinthians, God's Messianic community in Corinth, consisting of those who have been set apart by Yeshua the Messiah, and God called to be God's holy people, along with everyone who calls the name of Lord Yeshua the Messiah, their Lord as well as ours. Here's the NASB, to the church of God, which is at Corinth, those who have been sanctified in Christ Jesus, called saints, by calling with all those who in every place call on the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, their and ours, their Lord and ours. So the NASB, boy, this is a bad translation, Lockman, because here's the Greek. It's just, ecclesia, and then he's talking about Corinth, basically the sanctified of Corinth, right? I'm really bad at, is it hagiazo, basically the sanctified ones. And it's all split up here, right? But James, essentially Jacob, is a better one at really portraying these things. So look at his address. He's like, from Yaakov, the slave of God and Lord Yeshua, the Messiah, to the 12 tribes in the diaspora, Shalom. Here's the NASB. James, a bondservant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are in the dispersed abroad, greetings. And here it is in the Greek. Basically 2 and 10 for 12. Basically race. Anyway. Basically the 12 tribes in the diaspora. I'm not a Greek expert, but I can at least look at these things, right? 12 tribes, there's only 2 tribes left. To the 12 tribes, James, what are you talking about, right? Oh, if it's not just James, or Jacob as I like to call him, Peter, Kepha, an emissary of Yeshua the Messiah, to God's chosen people living as aliens in the diaspora, in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, and the provinces of Asia and Byzantia. This is where the Lockman Foundation really falls down, because they break up this alien, scattered, and chosen, when the Greek is going to say ekletos, basically chosen, paratibios, basically meaning alien or foreigner, and diaspora, to those in the diaspora, right, in the Greek. So, much like, actually, David Stern's translation, probably much closer to what the Greek is saying. So these apostolic writings are addressing the church, the ecclesia, as people that are in the dispersion. And if you remember what I said on the 4th of July, it's to a people that don't quite have a land yet. You are foreigners. And so here is a Revelation, Revelation 1:6 is like the address to the churches in Asia, who have called us to be a kingdom that is a priesthood for God. his Father. To him be the glory and rulership forever. Amen. So just these addresses are pointing to the churches being the 12 tribes of Israel, people among the dispersion, people that don't quite have a land of their own, people that Torah is written to, as I said a couple of days ago. It's Israel, right? It's not a separate organization called the church. It is the restored full house of Israel, house of Judah, two branches coming back together. Let's look at some of the apostolic arguments that Paul and others make. Ephesians is probably my favorite one. Therefore, remember your former state, you Gentiles by birth, you Goyim by birth, called the uncircumcised by those merely because of an operation of their flesh are called circumcised. At that time, you had no Messiah. You were estranged from the national life of Israel. You were foreigners to the covenant, embodied by God's promise. You were in this world without a hope of God, but now you who were once far off have been brought near by the shedding of Messiah's blood. You who were once Gentiles. I think he's referring to you no longer being a Gentile, because you have been brought near by Messiah's blood. And when the people are talking about tearing down, the wall that divides, I mean, he's essentially saying that it's the thing that comes back together. It's not this new race, the church. It's the restored Israel, For he himself is our Shalom. He made us both one and has broken down the wall that divides us by destroying his own body as an enmity occasioned by Torah with its commands set forth in forms of ordinances. He did this in order to create in union with himself from the two groups a single new humanity and thus make Shalom. Here's that sort of in the NASB Commonwealth, of course, meaning citizenship. You were once foreigners, have been brought close. You have now have citizenship in Israel. Peter and First Peter. You should just probably read First Peter. It's an incredible book, incredible letter. He's just referring to these churches in Asia, which, by the way, probably aren't Jews in any sense. In Asia Minor, there are mostly Gentiles living there, and Peter is writing to them. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Before you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you as aliens, temporary residents, to not give in to the desires of your old nature, which kept warring against you. Oh man, I forgot to highlight the important part. Dang it. The important part. But you are a chosen people, the king's Kohanim, a holy nation, a people for God to possess. Why? In order for you to declare the praises of the one who called you out of the darkness into his wonderful light. So he's saying you people, and he's using all these identifiers with Israel, a holy nation, kings, priests, a kingdom of priests, holy nation, ethnos hagios, people for God to possess, the cornerstone of the temple, all these, building blocks of the temple, not cornerstone, sorry. Temporary, you're aliens and temporary residents. So don't give in to the desires of your old nature. He's like saying you're not really Gentiles anymore. Anyway, he's using these identifiers with Israel and referring to the churches in Asia. Paul, boy, Romans 9, 10, and 11. This, we could probably talk about this for hours. I'm just going to quickly go through my highlighted ones. He's laying out this sort of narrative of Gentiles coming into the covenant and what it looks like and how it provokes Israel to jealousy so that all of Israel can be saved. Not just and when I first read that, I thought okay, there's Gentiles and there's Israel and they both get saved, right? Yeah. It's no, all of Israel includes the Gentiles. Anyway, let's just run through a couple of these points. The people of Israel, they were made God's children by the glory that had been given to them. The covenants are theirs, likewise giving Torah, the temple service, and their promises. For not everyone from Israel is truly a part of Israel. Indeed, not all the descendants are seed of Abraham. Rather, what is it to be called your seed will be Yitzhak? In other words, it is not the physical children who are the children of God, but the children the promise refers to are considered seed. So it's an adoption into the covenant. He goes on laying out this a little bit more. You are not my people. There they will be called sons of the living God. But Isaiah, referring to Israel, cries out, even if the people of Israel are as large as the number of grains in the sand of the sea, only a remnant will be saved. So people that would call on his name, really, and say it, only really is a small fraction. That means there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. God is the same for everyone, rich towards everyone who calls on his name. And he goes on, you got to tell people about this because this is incredible stuff. It's the same way in this present age. There's a remnant chosen by grace. And because they're stumbling, the deliverance has come to the Gentiles in order to provoke them to jealousy. He's talking about provoking Israel to jealousy because of just the riches of grace. No, the Gentiles are provoked to jealousy because Israel has the riches of the covenant. And here's, this is going to be a good one. It's going to be a reminder. However, to those who are Gentiles, I say this. Since I myself am an emissary sent to the Gentiles, I made known the importance of my work and hope that somehow I may provoke some of my own people to jealousy to save some of them. For casting Jesus aside means the reconciliation of the world. What will their accepting him mean? It will be life from the dead. Now, if Halah offered the first fruits of holy, so is the whole loaf. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, meaning you Gentiles, a wild olive, were grafted in among them, having become equal sharers in the rich root of the olive tree, then don't boast as it were you better the branches. However, if you do boast, remember that you are not supporting the root. The root is supporting you. So you'll say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. True. But so what? They were broken off because of their lack of trust. However, you keep your place only because of your trust. So don't be arrogant. On the contrary, be terrified. For God did not spare the natural branches. He certainly won't spare you. For if you were cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into the cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted in back into their own olive tree? He's talking about all Israel being saved. He's saying, you Gentiles, you wild olive tree, you have been grafted in. This sounds familiar, right? This sounds like Ezekiel. The two branches, the two sticks, the two trees will become one tree yet again. It's the picture of a restored Israel. And of course, Revelation is just a huge picture of this. And I don't want to make this video too long. We're already over an hour. But it's in Ezekiel 39, there's this battle with essentially the remaining Gentiles called Gog and Magog, and then God wipes them out, and it's the restored picture of Israel and Judah. And it's the same thing in Revelation 20. Instead of referring to it as the restored Israel, they refer to it as the saints, right? So it's the same exact story. You're just reading Ezekiel 39 over again. And there's all this imagery of a restored Israel throughout Revelation, and tribes, and Jerusalem and the 12 stones, and all these pictures coming as it comes down from heaven, and it's incredible stuff. And it's a beautiful picture of the end of an age, Messiah returning, and then the eventual new creation. It's all part of it, but really, it's a beautiful picture of the restored Israel, the real bride of Messiah. So, this view is you are Israel. Your identity is Israel. It means you essentially abandon your Gentile identity. I'm white, right? I don't really use that as an identifier anymore. Of Irish, French, Canadian, Catholic, Italian descent. That's who I am. Well, that's not really. That was my former nature. Because when I cling to my true identity as Israel, the bride of Messiah, I abandon all the old ways. And so in another video, I'm going to talk about the implications of this more. But if you're Israel, it means a lot. It means you are a nation set apart. It means you are part of the restored ones, but it really means you are part of the covenant. And it's a continuously unveiled covenant. There's not a brand new one. So I understand there's probably detractors from this idea, or people that don't really understand this idea. And so I have a couple questions for them. And one, when did God ever make a covenant with the Gentiles? If this were true, if there is some kind of covenant with the Gentiles and you're supposed to remain a Gentile and act like a Gentile and do your Gentile pagan things and keep doing them, not only that, but the church is affirming those things now too, right? Jeez. Anyway, when did God ever make a covenant with the Gentiles? Because I personally don't see it. But maybe you have something besides that. All I see is one continuously unveiled covenant. And so then the other question is, if Israel is gone away with for good, essentially that you remain a Gentile, right? And if Israel is gone, what do the promises that God said in, the Old Testament, what do they mean? See, my viewpoint here means God is going to be true to his promises. He is going to restore Israel. If he already is, right? Any other view sort of neglects the Old Testament narrative about the restoration of Israel. And how the coming Messiah is really important to those things. So, that's sort of the biblical view on ethnicity. And it's a lot. I understand. There's a lot there. And I didn't even cover everything. I'll be honest. I didn't even really scratch the surface. That's how much of a biblically tight, I think, view this is. I'm kind of exhausted after that, but I'm going to say, like this video, share it, please, subscribe. I'm really going to try and make more of these videos, really laying out this really counter-cultural narrative of what the biblical view of things is. Because pretty sure not a lot of people have heard this, and I'm sure a lot of you have disagreements with this. That's fine. We could talk about it. But that's the view. And I'm going to put a link. I've written a paper on this for seminary. By the way, I got kicked out of seminary, so whatever that's worth. I wrote this more succinctly in a paper, which you can read. I'll link it in the video. But yeah, thank you for joining. Remember that your identity is as Israel, and that you really shouldn't hold on to your Gentile identity. I think that's a bad idea, and we'll get into that further at different times. But thanks for joining me now. That was this for this video. Shalom to you all, and blessing.